Hey, everybody. I just had fun looking through your arguments about which is more important, rights or responsibilities. And the answer is yes. Uh, some of you, I think, accurately get to the heart of the situation when you say, what kind of society do you want to live in? And that's critical because let's frame it this way. Throughout human history, responsibility has always been on the table, rights have not been. To that end, I would pose this potential hypothetical to you. Imagine a society where there is only responsibility and little or no rights. That's not hard to imagine. We can look back to actual history to go, oh, yeah, people kind of lived in those scenarios. You were allowed to say, to think, to believe, to act, to marry, to do anything within a tightly circumscribed set of cultural expectations. And certainly under the control of whatever governing body existed above you. So it's not hard to imagine responsibility. Is it pleasant? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't celebrate living in a society where it's only responsibility. I would feel quite put upon and limited in my ability to pursue things that I find interesting or enjoyable. So imagine many of you would by your own explanations. Now, let's flip it. Can you imagine a hypothetical society in which there are only rights and no responsibilities? This is harder to imagine for a very good reason. Societies can't exist without the primary bedrock of responsibilities. It is the kind of society we want to live in that creates rights on top of it. To this end, let's look at the Declaration of Independence for a moment and the idea of communitarianism versus radical individualism or individualism. The reason that the early American experiment worked was a combination of factors. But you have to understand that the founding documents of the Declaration of the Constitution carving out a very limited government with the assumption that our rights exist because we exist. The government does not grant us rights, as many of you questioned, right? That idea. The founders made the argument, a subjective, not a factual argument. They made this opinion-based argument that we ought to view the world in terms of we all humans are born, all of us humans are born, and therefore we deserve our natural rights because of logic and reason, and human experience tells us it's better that way. And so we wrote founding documents and mission statements to that end, focusing very explicitly on individual rights and individual protections baked into the Constitution and in the later 10 amendments, right? The protections from government, freedom of speech. You get to have a gun to defend yourself. The government can come poking into your stuff without good cause, protections in the legal system, and the like. But you have to remember this political edifice, this creation, was set on top of a structure of responsibility and strong community connections and obligations and tightly bound social structures, a la Etzioni. Hopefully you can see how these things fit together. Now, I say all that not to tell you that one is more important than the other. I do suggest, though, that responsibilities necessarily come first, but just because one thing has to come first doesn't make it more important, only in order of existence. I wouldn't want to live in a society without rights. So take that for what you will. The point is this, and many of you get to it, they really go hand in hand in a society that you probably want to live in. We need rights so that we're not miserable and we can do things that bring us fulfillment and live in a way that's authentic. You get it. And we are responsible to allow other people to live similarly with some obvious constraints. So there you go. Rights are incredibly important in a decent society, and responsibilities are necessary for any society, right? So you've got this sufficient v necessary challenge, right? A good society, responsibility is necessary, but it's not sufficient. A good society requires both rights and responsibilities, right? Rights are necessary, but not sufficient. Responsibilities are necessary, but not sufficient. You cannot just have one in a decent society that we would enjoy living in. But you cannot have the existence of a society that has only rights and no responsibility. That can't exist. Think about it for a moment. I only get to do whatever I want to do to the maximum extreme, but nothing is expected of me. It just doesn't make any sense. It's a logical inconsistency there. One of you brought up something interesting about governments and governments being the basis for our rights and challenging the idea that we have inherent rights as humans. You're not alone. And in fact, I'm glad you brought that up. Can't remember which one of you. In our week 7 article, Pistrito's article on the administrative state, one of the challenges that Frank Goodenow brings up in the later portion of the article is not only does he stand against the constitutional principles of separation of powers, which is designed to protect minority groups, but also the individual, because it sets a playing field with established rules, and the rule of law is what protects the individual and groups that are outside of the power majority at the time. He challenges that so that they can have their administrative state. Also, he specifically challenges the idea that we have inalienable rights from a creator, or even that predate the existence of a government. He says, well, no, you have rights based on the political and cultural circumstances of the place and time that you live. And he's not alone. And more modern thinkers, specifically Dino Adis of Tulane University, said the exact same thing. You do not have these magical rights pulled out of the air. You have rights based on a time and a place. If that is the case in reality, and if we operate based on that, here's an important distinction. There can be things that are true. Then there are things that we assume to be true. And depending on which one we operate can lead us down very different paths. So here's an example. If we assume that we humans are unique individuals and we are born with inalienable rights, then what follows is it is necessary, ethically and morally, for a government to protect those rights. If you don't believe that, if instead you believe, no, the government comes first and then your rights come after that, that puts us from a Kantian perspective in the first scenario into a utilitarian perspective in the second scenario, and then your rights can be whatever the government says and whatever the government deems appropriate for whatever circumstance. That can get scary. Quite scary, in fact. If you follow utilitarian logic to its end, it is not always pretty. Sometimes it's appropriate, not always. Here's an example hypothetical that I use in my classrooms. And philosophy, law school, things like that, you'll come across this sort of hypothetical. We all live in a perfect utopian town, village, whatever. All of us from class, maybe the whole university, who knows what, right? 100, 1,000, 10,000, kind of doesn't matter. And we are all perfectly fulfilled, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, economically. When we get all that we want, all the foods we want, all the interests fulfilled, our physical activity, our emotional connections, social capital is abundant. There's just one caveat. Once a day or a week, whatever, one member of society in some rotation has to go down into a dank, dark, moldering, rat-infested dungeon and torture an innocent, starving, naked little child, crying and begging for mercy. And you have to get down there with your hot pokers and your knives and your hammers and your tongs and torture away. Who takes that deal? From a utilitarian perspective, the answer is obvious. We all take that deal because we all benefit nearly infinitely, so that one individual alone suffers infinitely. Most people still don't take that trade-off. And so I bring this up to challenge the idea of what it means for our rights to come from the government and not to exist before the government. If the government is determinate of what your rights are and what morality is and what is appropriate and inappropriate, we can go down some dark paths. And we've seen that happen through different political and ideological experiments throughout human history. Operating on the fictional idea that we have inalienable rights is better for humans than the alternative. Get off my soapbox. It's always fun to listen to people approach this, and it's always a challenge. And most of you reasonably come to the conclusion that in a good society, you have to have a balance of both. You cannot have one or the other. You need both. And though you might prefer one or the other, that often, interestingly, relates back to our innate values and our innate philosophical perspectives that Haidt mentions in week 1. If you, for example, come from a background or perceive a lack or a dearth of access to rights, then rights are really important. If you feel like you've never had a challenge to your rights, then it's easier maybe to say that responsibility is more important. These are just subjective, opinion-based approaches, and there is no right answer as to which one is most important. Ultimately, we have to accept that rights and responsibilities might be more or less important based on the individual, and we have to accept that reality. But it's a worthwhile concept to consider. And I'll go, if you'll follow me, one step further. One of you brought up the idea of the state of nature and the idea that governments, right, create these rights. If any of you have the time or interest, and you can Google this, you can use the YouTubes and whatnot to go look up Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, and his book, his theory, The Leviathan. In this, coming out of the Civil War period in Great Britain, the UK, Great Britain, he posits that in some state of nature, it's a war of all against all. Each one of us is just out for ourselves in a short, brutish, and nasty existence. It's cutthroat, and even though you're bigger and stronger than me, you're going to have to go to sleep sometime. And that's when the rock comes crashing down, and I get to take your stuff. And there you are, out of the picture. We don't want to live in this world, so we create governments, the Leviathan. This is a bit of a Faustian bargain. This is the social contract. We voluntarily give up some of our rights, our freedoms that exist in the state of nature to do anything we want. We give some of those up so that we can live in a stable, structured society where all of our individual behaviors are limited so that we don't all kill each other. And so one of you brought up an interesting point that made me think of that, and I hope it's worth considering. Our founders were very well aware of this concept. Governments are an imposition on people's freedoms, but governments also provide a context, an environment in which we can all live together in some amount of peace and harmony, hopefully. On top of that, we know that government sometimes takes care of things that any individual or even a group of individuals can't on their own facilitate. The collection of taxes for infrastructure, military, fire, police, medicine, and these types of things. So take that and do what you will with it, and we'll talk again soon.